Hi there, this is Jacob Nash, and this is a review of Module 26 on classical conditioning. If you are just watching this straight in order, you might have not known this if you're watching this like a long time later, but sorry that I had to make these out of order if you're someone that was waiting. But now I'm kind of back on track, and I'm picking up where I left off because I made like a few in the late 40s. Now I'm back on this. Okay. So classical conditioning is what this is on. All right. So first, let's just talk about learning. That's what this unit is about, right? So learning, by definition, is the process of acquiring new, relatively enduring information or behaviors. It's studied by the behaviorists like Watson and Skinner that you already learned about in an earlier module. So habituation, I think we already talked about that on a different module, maybe not, but the definition of it is decreased response with increased exposure. So what does that mean? So, well, first of all, what does it not mean? It's not the same thing as sensory adaptation that you just learned about in the last one. Or wait, was that the last one? I don't know. No, that wasn't the last unit, but just too bad. It's not the same thing as sensory adaptation, since this relates to learning, not senses. So it's like almost the same. It's pretty much the same thing, but it's not. Like if that makes sense. Like the definition is pretty much the same, but one of them is talking about senses and one of them is talking about learning. So hopefully that makes sense. But anyway, so let's say that this dad gets a toy for his baby. The baby's really excited the first time, but after the 46th time, oh, I don't think that baby likes that anymore. So there's decreased response. As the days go by, the baby is less and less interested in it. So now let's talk about the two conditioning types. We're going to talk about the other one, operant, in the next module, but right now we're just talking about classical in this module. So this is, I'm still going to talk about both of them. I'm actually going to talk about operant first, but I'm going to talk more about it in the next module. But for this video, I'll just talk about it first. So this is a type of learning in which consequences shape our strength of a certain behavior. So if there is a bad or a good outcome, then the behavior is strengthened. If it's a bad outcome, then it's weakened. So let's say Jim Carrey dances. He's just dancing for no particular reason. He just happens to be. And then he gets money. Then he's going to keep doing it. That's what it's like in operant conditioning. He has a good result. That's what he likes that. He likes those Franklin's there. And then he's going to keep doing it. But if people get really mad and they don't like his dancing, then he's probably going to stop. That's not the outcome he wanted. So it's pretty straightforward. A good thing makes someone keep doing it. Bad thing makes them not. But we're going to talk more about that later. But anyways, classical though, this is learning in which two things can eventually be linked with each other, which predicts events. And if that doesn't make sense, then look at this. This is something you got to know. So you see NS, US, UR, CS, CR. So that might seem confusing right now, but you got to know those 5 different things. And this is always what it's like. This is always what order it is. So over here, these 2 things, see with the equal signs, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Unconditioned it means it's not something that was really modified. It's just a natural thing that is just a result. So if a stimulus is any kind of thing that could provoke a response, by the way, but unconditioned stimulus, US for short, let's say it's money. That makes Jim Carrey dance because he's happy. So forget this. I know I use the same dancing thing. So don't don't even think about this operand right now, okay? Just only think about this. Let's say money makes him dance, okay? So, but then over here we have something called the neutral stimulus, so music. And right now that does nothing. If he hears the music, he's like, doesn't do anything. But eventually, if these two things both happen, so I really should have put a plus sign here. If both of these happen, then it's still gonna he's gonna dance. But we assume that it's because of the money, because that's the unconditioned stimulus with the unconditioned response. But eventually, with enough time and classical conditioning, you can take away the money and he'll dance just with the music. So basically, it's like originally that was the thing that caused him to dance, but this thing was paired with it, so he eventually learned to have that automatic conditioned response with that conditioned stimulus. So if you notice, the neutral stimulus always turns into the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response, in most cases, turns into the conditioned response. For our purposes in AP psychology, that always will. So you notice these two things are the same. Eventually, this is just doesn't matter. This is what eventually results in this. So I hope that makes sense. This is just an example. You can replace this with any kind of thing, but it's always like originally something else caused that response, but you add it with something else, and eventually that will. This was discovered by Ivan Pavlov. You need to know that. So what he figured out was he noticed that dogs salivate, which means they just have like they slobber basically when they see food. And eventually they would do that anytime they see the person that gives them the food. That's what he realized. So do you see what that means? So the Jim Carrey dancing is like the dog salivating. The money is like the food, and then the music is like the person giving the food. So eventually they will change it to where they'll salivate anytime they see the person that gives them the food, because they assume that's what's going to happen. They learn to associate those things. So I hope that makes sense. It's like just at first something else caused a response, but once it was paired with something else, then that ends up being the thing that caused the response. So now let's talk about three things: acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. So we're still using this example, okay? Acquisition, that is simply our ability to come to this point where something will become the conditioned stimulus. At first it was neutral, and then now it's conditioned stimulus. So that's what acquisition is. It's just the ability to get to this point to where now something else is causing the response. Extinction, that's when after what can cause extinction is if the learning or the practicing of this goes away. So if it's a long time since this has happened, the music will result in no response. That's extinction. So there are graphs that display that after a certain amount of time of not practicing a certain conditioning, then the conditioned stimulus will no longer result in a response. That's extinction. Spontaneous recovery can be that all of a sudden, whoa, all out of nowhere, they can just the conditioned response will happen again. It will be a spontaneous response. So you got to know those things, right? And then two more, okay? Generalization and discrimination. They're, for our purposes, somewhat of opposite. So we already kind of learned about generalization in a different sense. Remember how we were saying if it's generalized and other researchers can use it. We're talking about something different for this. So, okay, just so you know, this is something different. Generalization, this is just, in this sense, when similar stimuli will result in the same CR. So CR is conditioned response. So notice how this time it's green. So it's not the same thing, but it results in the same conditioned response. It's like, okay, same thing pretty much, I'll still dance. Discrimination, though, is when a similar stimuli does not. So sometimes this will happen instead. If we have the ability to discriminate, then he'll be like, I know that's not the same thing. So there's no response. So they're kind of opposites of each other if you want to think about it that way. Okay, so let's talk about two ways that classical conditioning has been used. One we might say for bad, and the other we might say for good. So, little Albert, I already talked about this, I think, in a different module, but it's something that Watson did. So, see this guy? This is Watson, a behavioralist. So, here's what he did. I already talked about this before, but I just didn't explain it in depth, like telling you that it was classical conditioning, because that wasn't what you knew it was then. But basically, a baby named Albert was not afraid of rats. So that was the rat is the neutral stimulus. This is not put in the same way as you would commonly see it, but the rat is the neutral stimulus. So the baby, okay, Albert's like, I don't know, that's just some random thing. But then this is the unconditioned stimulus, and it results in an unconditioned response. The unconditioned things, they are just basically what a natural response kind of is. He hears a loud noise, he's scared. That's just normal. That's just like how Jim Carrey would dance more. He would dance when he sees the money. That's just like a natural thing. Or the dog would salivate when it sees food. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. But when it's paired with something else, so every time Albert hears the loud noise, a rat happens to be there. Then he'll start to cry when he sees the rat without the noise. This is our acquisition. So that's how that a lot. Albert died at age 4 or 5. So I don't think that it was disclosed how or why. At that point, he was not in Watson's care anymore. But a lot of people definitely consider this to be unethical. I don't think he would have gotten away with this in modern days. All right, let's talk about aversion therapy. That's another way we can use classical conditioning, but this time we might say for good. So this is using classical conditioning to help with alcoholism. So same thing. We have a drug results in nausea. That's the natural response. Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. That's just naturally what it's like. That would do that. Just like Albert afraid of a loud noise. Just like dog salivating because of food. Just like Jim Carrey dancing because of money. But then there's a neutral stimulus, which is like the boombox for Jim Carrey, the person giving the food for the dogs, the rat for Albert, that eventually, when paired with that other thing, the drug in this case, results in that. So now alcohol is nausea. Person giving the food is salivating. Music is dancing, and then rat is scared. So there you go. I hope this makes sense. Now you've had some examples, but you got to know about the little Albert thing, and you got to know about the aversion therapy. Okay, so let's have some questions now. When does extinction of a behavior occur? It occurs in classical conditioning when an unconditioned stimulus does not follow a conditioned stimulus. Well, it's basically, this is just telling you what it is. It's not saying this is not the cause of it. The cause of it is if classical conditioning does not occur, you just don't practice it for a while. But in operant conditioning, I know I didn't talk about this really, but that was classical conditioning, but it can occur in operant conditioning too, but that's when a response is no longer reinforced. So we're going to talk about this, but a consequence of a behavior reinforces something, but if it doesn't, then that will make it extinct. All right, but you don't have to know that really right now. Okay, the tendency once a response has been conditioned for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to have a similar response. So when it does have a response, when it's similar, that's generalization. But when it does not, see, that's what number 3 is saying. What is it called when they learn to respond differently? So remember how Jim Carrey was like, oh, I know that's something different, like when he saw the green one. Okay, that's discrimination. That's pretty much the opposite of number 2. Create an example of classical conditioning. Okay, Early is frightened by a car horn. One day, someone decides to play a B flat on the guitar before beeping a horn loudly. Eventually, Early is frightened anytime he hears a B flat on guitar. So it's like, and then he's afraid of that. All right, explain classical conditioning research with rats and immune system. Well, remember, I don't make these questions, and I know I didn't talk about that. But in my opinion, you don't really even need to know this, but it might just be a good thing to know, I guess. It's another thing, but an unconditioned stimulus would result in an immune system response, and eventually some other sort of neutral stimulus would become a conditioned stimulus, resulting in an immune system response. So, it's just all these different examples. Something results in something after conditioning. What's an unconditioned stimulus? Remember, that's the thing that automatically or naturally triggers a response when paired with a neutral. Well, not always when it doesn't have to be paired, but it could even if it wasn't with it. So what's habituation, right? That's decreased response with increased exposure. So the more you see or are exposed to something, the less of a response you'll have. Remember the baby with that toy. Name the perspective that uses classical conditioning to treat people who suffer from alcoholism. Well, yeah, that's just okay. That's not that was kind of a dumb question. But really the answer is aversion therapy. That's not necessarily perspective, but the behaviorists are the ones, use it. What's a conditioned stimulus? It is what the neutral stimulus becomes after classical conditioning, which at times, or most of the time, for our purposes, all the time, results in the same unconditioned or the same unconditioned response that there was, which is now considered the conditioned response. What happens when one links a neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus so the neutral stimulus begins triggering the conditioned response? That's called acquisition. What is a discriminative stimulus? It's a stimulus that causes a response after it is associated with reinforcement. That's not even a module 26 thing. Sorry. I hate these questions. And you might ask, why don't you just make your own? Because these are, even if they are dumb, sometimes they are usually something that would help with an exam or test. That's the reason why. But yeah, that's something for module 27. So sorry, you get a preview, I guess. Classical conditioning, operant conditioning are based on what perspective? Behaviorism. Whoa, so cool. No final slide. That's it.